Well, good evening, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Arzu Osanlu, and I'm an associate professor in the program in Law, Societies, and Justice, and I welcome you here tonight. This evening's keynote lecture is being held in conjunction with a two-day symposium on Islam and Forgiveness, Reflections on Justice and Conflict Resolution in Muslim Societies. I have a long list of thank yous, so I hope you'll enjoy this and bear with me. But this event has greatly benefited from the support of numerous people and units on this campus, as well as off. I first have to thank the Simpson Center for the Humanities and their director, Kathy Woodward, for adopting this project and supporting it in innumerable ways. My thanks go to my own unit, Law, Societies, and Justice, as well as the Center for Comparative Law and Society Studies, the PhD program in the School of Law, and the Department of Anthropology have generously supported this project as well. The Fetzer Institute, based in Kalamazoo, Michigan, whose initiative on supporting research on love and forgiveness has been one of the driving forces of this project. And so they're not present here today, but I do thank them for their generous support as well. In planning for this event, I have had the distinct privilege of working with a tremendously patient, organized, and the gracious staff at the Simpson Center for the Humanities. And my deep appreciation goes to Caroline Hansen, who has been doing all the behind-the-scenes work to make this event run smoothly, as well as Chelsea Yates for their support and attention to detail. I also have to say the same for my own research assistant, Sarah Dreyer, who has contributed to the publicity for this wonderful event and numerous other behind-the-scenes details. What I have envisioned for this project is a kind of scaling up from my own ethnographic research, which takes place in Iran, to a study of Islam and forgiveness that is not only a broadening of ethnographic locales and an approach that examines the multiple layers of social conflict and resolution practices in Muslim-majority societies, but also a deeper engagement with the humanistic registers rooted in the Islamic principles which guide the lives of Muslims today. On any given day, a Muslim will repeat the words, "In the name of God, the merciful, the beneficent," at least 17 times during prayers. Numerous verses of the Quran direct Muslims to be merciful, forgiving, and to reconcile their differences, as do the hadith, the lived examples from the Prophet's time. Our keynote speaker for today, Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl, is one of the few scholars who has endeavored to show the significance of these qualities and has highlighted them as core moral values in Islam. He is singularly qualified to explicate their jurisprudential sources, illuminate their humanistic foundations, and speak to them as lived experiences. Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl is the Alfie Distinguished Professor in Islamic Law at the UCLA School of Law and chair of the Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program at UCLA, where he teaches a number of courses, among them International Human Rights Law, Islamic Jurisprudence, National Security Law, Islam and Human Rights, and many, many more. He also holds the chair in Islam and Citizenship at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on Islamic law and a prominent scholar on human rights. As a prolific scholar and public intellectual, Professor Abou El Fadl is the author of 14 books and over 50 articles. His work has been translated into numerous languages, including Arabic, Persian, French, Norwegian, Dutch, Ethiopian, Russian, and Japanese, among others. He has been awarded numerous honors and distinctions. We would be here very late into the night if I listed all of them. But just to name a few, Professor Abou El Fadl was awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award, the Leo and Liesel Edinger Prize in 2007, and was named a Carnegie Scholar in Islamic Law in 2005. He was previously appointed by President George Bush to serve on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom and has served as a member of the Board of Directors for Human Rights Watch. Professor Abou El Fadl is most well known for his scholarly approach to Islam from a moral point of view. He writes extensively on themes of humanity, morality, human rights, justice, and mercy, and is regarded for his writings on beauty as a core moral value of Islam. Professor Abou El Fadl has appeared on national and international television and radio and has published widely in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, and many others. His most recent work focuses on authority, human rights, democracy, and beauty in Islam and Islamic law. His book, The Great Theft, which was published in 2005, was the first work to delineate the key differences between moderate and extremist Muslims, and was named one of the top 100 books of the year by Canada's leading newspaper, Globe and Mail. His book, The Search for Beauty in Islam, A Conference of the Books, which is a groundbreaking work on Muslim scholarship, which according to Harvard professor Roy Mutahide, suggests a new spiritual ethic. Professor Abou El Fadl holds a BA in political science from Yale University, a JD from the University of Pennsylvania School of Law, and an MA and PhD in Islamic law from Princeton University. He is also an Islamic jurist and scholar, having received 13 years of systematic instruction in Islamic jurisprudence, grammar, and eloquence in Egypt and Kuwait. This evening, he will address the topic of forgiveness in Islam, and his talk is entitled Forgiveness in an Unforgiving World, the Theology of Shahada in the Modern Age. Please join me in welcoming Professor Abou El Fadl.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I thank the organizers for both the symposium that preceded this talk and for inviting me. Seattle is a bit too cold for my taste, but otherwise, and it has great bookstores. It's something is dying out in LA for whatever reason. Bookstores are disappearing. The subject of forgiveness, I'm going to start out from outside the Islamic context first and put into or position the discourse on forgiveness in some of the Western scholarship. Intuitively, we know that forgiveness comes in a variety of contexts and in a variety of specific forms. So we can speak about interpersonal forgiveness that could take place between friends or couples or any type of relationship. We can talk about political reconciliation, political types of forgiveness, like, for instance, the Clinton and Monica Lewinsky debacle, if you remember. We can talk about forgiveness as a means of reconciling parties that are heading towards an inimical or extremely or increasingly inimical relationship. And we can also talk about forgiveness as a method of conflict resolution. Now, why is it important to differentiate these various forms of forgiveness? And I didn't give an exhaustive list, but simply an illustrative list, because it matters a great deal both within the Islamic context and outside the Islamic context what we exactly are talking about. So just to give you to texture the investigation a bit and to give a sense of the type of issues that arise in this field, there is an ongoing debate, which might surprise some of you, about whether forgiveness as a human affair, not as a godly affair, is a modern phenomena or a pre-modern phenomena as well. There's a book written by David Constant. It's called The Origins of a Moral Idea, in which he argues, for instance, that the concept of interpersonal forgiveness, in the full sense of the term, did not exist in ancient Greece, in ancient Greek law, or in ancient Roman law. And it goes on to argue that, in fact, it doesn't exist in the Hebrew Bible, nor does it exist in the New Testament, or in the early Jewish and Christian commentaries on the Holy Scriptures. And it would be centuries, according to David Constant, that forgiveness, again, interpersonal is what he has in mind, was the accompanying idea of apology, regret, remorse, promise not to do the offending behavior again, really emerges in the 18th/19th century, and only, according to this work, only when the Christian concept of divine forgiveness was secularized and forgiveness was taken away from God's province, and a revolution in human thought took place to bring forgiveness from a divine concept to an earthly concept, something that can be accomplished by through human traits. Now, of course, there is a historical background to this type of discourse, and there's a school of historical thought that believes that the idea of forgiveness itself was seen in pre-modern era as with such reverence and such awe that it was thought that the only truly powerful could forgive, and hence the only one that truly could forgive was either God or the representative of God in some form or another, including a king or royalty or a religious establishment, and that without that type of hardened ability, forgiveness at an interpersonal level was seen as, interestingly enough, as a form of arrogance and lack of humility. Now, it's important to recall this context and problematize it, because otherwise we will approach the Islamic context in an all too simplistic and presumptive fashion. In fact, we'll find that Islamic debates had their own layers of texture, but for a different historical trajectory than what might have emerged in the West, assuming even that the idea that interpersonal forgiveness is a modern invention, which I have to admit to you, I share. I do have a skepticism towards historians that attempt to say that truly humanistic ideas were only achieved after they were liberated from God's tentacles, so to speak. They seem to be ideologically motivated for my taste. But anyway, that's not our issue. Now, clearly, in the Quranic text itself and the early oral tradition attributed to the Prophet or to various figures that I will mention, forgiveness is identified as a virtue, and it is not forgiveness in the sense of a absolution of sins or fault, but even in the early Quranic revelations, the idea of forgiveness as a form of pardoning someone for their transgressions is present, and it is debated at a variety of levels. So, for instance, one of the early Quranic revelations, which talks about addressing the Prophet, but also addressing early Muslims, says, فَصْفَحَ الصَّفْحَ الجَّمِيلَ, speaking to the Prophet, says that when you are confronted by insult, then forgive a beautiful forgiveness. Isfah literally means pardon. And so, for instance, when you say, I forgave someone, say, صَفَحْتُ عَنْهُ, I forgave him. And the idea of Isfah al-Safha al-Jamil, a beautiful forgiveness, will come to play into the construction of quite a bit of Islamic theology at a later point. Again, same type of Quranic discourse, which inspires a variety of oral reports and theological commentaries, goes something like this: فَاصْفَحْ عَنْهُمْ وَقُلْ سَلَامًا فَسَوْفَ يَعْلَمُونَ. Pardon them, again, Quran speaking to the Prophet, pardon them and say salam, say peace, for verily they will come to know. Now, another genre of this same revelation instructs the Prophet to, and his followers to, forgive and to turn away from the ignorant. And this actually turns out to be theologically quite significant, because this gives rise to, in the early tafsir debates, as well in the early works of theologians like Ibn Abi Dunya, relatively early compared to others, meaning, an argument about, well, are the ignorant the ones who are being pardoned, or the ignorant the ones who resist forgiveness? And why does this matter? Because if you are forgiving someone but calling them ignorant, then you really haven't forgiven them. You still consider them ignorant. So in what sense have you really forgiven? And someone, Ibn Abi Dunya, tells us, no, the ignorant are the ones that blame the Prophet for not returning the insult or the transgression and see it as a form of weakness. Now, this discourse in Islamic theology definitely is in the background. It affects, we even see this forgiveness as a virtue, as ill-defined as it is, in some of the early works on theology, even the works of Qadi bin Abdul Jabbar in his Rasail al-Khamsa, his 5 epistles, or even in his magnum opus al-Mughni, which deals with the nature of good and the nature of evil. What does it mean to enjoin the good and resist what's not good? Of course, something that affects later on Ibn Rushd and affects from Ibn Rushd to Thomas Aquinas and the whole natural law tradition. But for Qadi Abdul Jabbar, in this treatment, he first talks about whether forgiveness is always a virtue, or can it be actually at times something that is not virtuous. And he reminds me, I mean, of course, it's very interesting when you read dense medieval text, and then you find some modern philosophers repeating the same arguments in our current age, and they think they're being very brilliant. I don't know, before you decide you're brilliant, read a lot. That's my advice. Anyway, Khaled Abou, for instance, has this in his Mughni, his 8-volume work, this whole argument about, well, if you forgive to feel better, to alleviate your burden as a human being, and to even explicitly says, to free yourself from the fire and contempt of hatred, colorful language, but you do not obtain any type of guarantee that the person that you forgave will not repeat the behavior, then haven't you committed an injustice against the other? In the sense that, well, if you forgive an offender, and the offender then takes this as a form of an empowerment of their sense of arrogance and ego to perpetuate further injustice, having to then, in fact, forgiveness turn from virtue to its opposite. And then even someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, I mean, I don't mean anything derogatory when I say someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, but Ibn Taymiyyah in his famous long treatise on, I say long, it's multi-volumes, on the relationship between Sharia and Aql, much later, of course, talks about is forgiveness by definition unjust if it is made without shura, without consultation. And this, there's a reason for that, a genesis or rootedness for this idea, is that one of the passages of the Quran says, فَاصْفَحْ عَنْهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, forgive them and consult with them. And Ibn Taymiyyah raises the question, well, if he first has a grammatical argument that the waw here is harf atf, forget the grammar. Grammatical argument is not important. But he has then he gets to the substantive point, which he says basically that is the Quran talking about that if forgiveness is committed or forwarded or volunteered in a way in which it augments the sense of anger in the community rather than heal it. If it's done in an individual capacity without making sure that the family is on board, or without making sure that the tribe is on board, so it raises a sense, the sense of injustice. So is it a virtue in this context? And for Ibn Taymiyyah, at least, he falls within the school that says forgiveness without consultation, without shura, meaning without consensus building in our modern language, is a form of serving the ego. Now, just to put it in context, someone like a philosopher like Ibn Tufayl coming in response to Ibn Taymiyyah, and he says, well, this argument has a deep flaw in it, and that is, what if consensus building would require the virtuous to become unvirtuous? So basically, your moral sense cannot achieve consensus. And after a long philosophical discussion, we get the conclusion in Tufaz that what God requires is best efforts to build a consensus towards forgiveness, but ultimately, when all is said and done, it's an individual moral responsibility. Now, just a flavor of this discourse with someone like Ibn Ata al-Sikandari. He says, فَمَنْ عَفَى فَقَدْ عَفَى عَنْ نَفْسِهِ وَاسْتَحَقَّ عَفْوَ رَبِّهِ. Now this is very fascinating. That who forgives has forgiven himself first and now deserves God's forgiveness. Now the idea that who forgives himself first is mystically fascinating at so many levels. That when you forgive the other, you absolve yourself before else, and only then you deserve God's mercy. Anyway, this debate about forgiveness as virtue really becomes interesting for lawyers or for jurists when it is handled within the context of the legal system. And the Islamic legal system had a considerable difficulty with the idea of forgiveness as an institution of law. Good law is not always good philosophy. And what is sound philosophy is not always sound law. And Muslim jurists were quite sensitized to this. And in fact, not only that, but quite often the tension between law and theology itself is there. So I'll give you an example. Ibn Arabi, a Maliki jurist, he was writing in the 6th century Islamic era, 15th century Christian era, writes the following, and I'm quoting this from him. The rights of human beings are not forgiven by God. The rights of human beings are not forgiven by God unless the human being concerned forgives first. And the claims for such rights are not dismissed by God unless they are dismissed by the person aggrieved first. The rights of a Muslim cannot be abandoned except by the possessor of right. So even the ruler, the imam, does not have the right to demand or abandon such rights in the name of forgiveness. This is because the imam is not empowered to act as the agent of the individual as the agent for a specific set of individuals over their specific set of rights. Rather, the imam only represents people generally over the general and unspecified rights. A Hanafi jurist around the same period in the 15th century, his name is Al-Ayini, says that the usurper of property, even if a government official, will not be forgiven by God for his sins, even if he repents 1,000 times, unless he first returns the stolen property. Now, let's take these examples first. So why is this problematic philosophically or theologically? Well, the idea that God will not pardon a sin unless it is first pardoned by a human being was seen by many theologians and philosophers as a limitation upon the immutability of God. How could it be that God would make God's own forgiveness contingent upon the forgiveness of the aggrieved? But yet, at the same time, a serious problematic for many of these jurists is that it would be fundamentally unfair and unjust for the aggrieved not to enjoy a level of restitution or even apology or some acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and yet for God to forgive anyway. So, for instance, in Kitab, one genre of literature in which you find a lot of discussion about the stuff or these issues is a genre of literature known as al-munaza'at wal-mukhasamat. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, modern Muslims have not published many of these manuscripts on al-munaza'at wal-mukhasamat. And for all the people that study fatwa, remember that the fatwa is non-binding law, but the munaza'at and mukhasamat were actual cases and binding adjudications. Anyway, just for the graduate students. So in the munaza'at and mukhasamat, you find a Hanafi source reporting the judgment of a qadi in Kufa in the 5th century Hijrah, so that would make it around the 10th, 11th century, depending. It discusses a category of someone who was beaten by the market inspector unfairly for suspicion of cheating, and he comments, وَقَدْ ضُرِبَ ظُلْمًا وَأُنْصِفَ سِرًّا, meaning that the person was beaten by the market inspector unjustly, and the market inspector acknowledges errors secretly, not publicly. He came up to him and said, I'm sorry, I should have beaten you. But we get this remarkable discussion about what good is that? He apologized to him, but he had embarrassed him publicly and then apologized secretly. That's no good. Now, what I'm getting to is two concepts. We start finding in various Maliki, Shafi'i texts in particular, and some Hanbali texts some Hanafi texts, especially the Munaza'at and Mukhasamat literature from Egyptian Hanafi jurists, or even some Shamis, Syria and so on. An addition that, and I might be wrong because the literature is vast and most of it is still in manuscript form and so on, but I don't think existed in the earlier centuries. And that is the progression to the idea that God's forgiveness is not necessarily conditional on human forgiveness, but God can forgive, or God would be predisposed to forgive if there is an apology, a public apology, and some form of qasam or oath to be taken not to repeat the offense again. Now, the contexts here are fascinating. Now, I'll just share with you some of them. So, one of the cases, a man had entered a stipulation in his marriage contract that he would never ban his wife from visiting or seeing her parents. And then he told her she can't see her parents. And this is from a case, a munaza, the 12th century, the 6th century Hijrah in Basra. She says, okay, well, you violated your condition, I want a divorce. It's a long story, but basically he goes to the judge and he says, no, the children, I love her, and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And then she says, well, how do I know that if I forgive him, he won't do it again? So the judge orders that he takes an oath on the Quran, on the risk of his soul being doomed to hell forever, that he would never repeat the behavior. We have, there were earlier presentations, a very good presentation on trusts and waqfs and contractual issues. There is a case, or several cases, that involve a habitual borrowers, and I call them habitual borrowers and whiners. They borrow, they can't pay back, and then they cry because they can't pay back their loan, and they go and say, my family's starving, I'm starving, everyone is starving, you know, okay, so what are you gonna get if you imprison me, and if you sell everything, my children will all become homeless, and so on. So we start seeing, especially in Iraq and Egypt, this procedure, which again, I don't see in the first 4 centuries at least, of an apology and an oath, or sometimes a written guarantee that no more loans. That's it. You're not going to borrow anymore. Quite fascinating. Now, I'll give you one more example, and then, you know, because this stuff I can. Okay, I lied. 2 more examples. One comes from the law of rebellion, and where a rebel, for a variety of reasons, a rebel can repent, but in order to be pardoned, to be forgiven, must promise not to return to the rebellion, not to rebel again, but is not required to render an apology. And there is a long discussion about this, that a rebel, because his rebellion is based on a possible just cause, and I wrote a long, boring, very boring book called Islamic Law of Rebellion. If you really don't have a life, you know, be my guest, read it. For that person, they don't have to apologize, because an apology would inevitably lead to the punishment of the most principled rebels, which is not. But for an apostate, Muslim jurists often did insert a demand of an apology, unlike earlier jurisprudence or what we see in earlier sources. The second example, a theft where a person, before being caught, if a theft is committed in the course of a highway robbery, returning the money before being caught does not act as mitigating circumstances. But if the theft was committed not in the context of a highway robbery, but in the context of stealth of one form or another, returning the money, in the view of many jurists, would lead to a forgiveness if the owner of the money would have forgiven. But we start seeing, again, as far as I can tell in the books of texts on Munaza'at and Mukhasamat, beginning from the 10th century onwards, a demand that the person acknowledge that they did not steal the property under a claim of right, and therefore apologize for taking the property, which is, again, quite fascinating. Now, this leads me to the final category, and that is what I believe is the most mature theological attempts to reconcile the theological trajectory with the legal aspects of the debates. And we find this in the works of people like Mullah Sadr or Ibn Arabi, and that is to rekindle a Quranic discourse that is surprisingly not present in the earlier theological debates. And much of the discourse on forgiveness would, as I noted, would raise the issue of justice, qist. But there are 2 Quranic passages that captured later theologians, the attention of later theologians, that I think are quite fascinating. One goes something like this, that يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط, those who believe. كونوا قوامين, قوامين is the same word as قيامة or قيم على, which means servants of or upholders of justice, شهداء لله, bearing witness to God. And the second verse flips that relationship and it says, كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط, that be servants or steadfast upholders of God, serving justice. Now, as you can imagine, theologians had a field day with why does one verse say, stand upright for justice, bearing witness for God, and the second says, stand upright for God, but bear witness for justice. And the fascinating synthesis is that we find, and especially in many of the Sufi texts, that justice and God and the process of bearing witness for, and I have to skip several, it is not possible. It is not, it cannot be reconciled unless to bear witness either for justice or for God, one must be cleansed of their own egos, their own egotistical positions, and their own investiture in matters of egotistical conflicts. That true testimony, true shahada, true witnessing for God. There's another verse that says something to the effect that we have made you a middle nation or a just nation so you can bear witness for God. And the discourse goes on that, well, in order to bearing witness for God is not possible, or bearing witness for justice is not possible, unless you are able to stand at some distance from conflict. And standing some distance from the conflict is not possible without an internalization of what divinity and justice require. And what divinity and justice require in this discourse is rahma and tarahum, mercy, and the exchange of mercy with others. But mercy in this discourse is a broad concept that is not necessarily co-equal with justice. It is a precondition of justice, but not co-equal with justice. Rather, true justice comes from the objectivity of forgiveness. And that is a fascinating idea for anyone that knows the debates on forgiveness. That in order to truly bear witness, and one of the examples given is can someone who has not, someone who constantly battles over the minutiae of life with their family, for instance, claim to be a just witness for God? See, there's a difference between a witness before a judge and a witness before God and or before justice, or for God and for justice. That type of testimony, which is a sort of a transcendental demand, that type of idea that you reach for beyond the material world, beyond the physical, to a state of, as the discourse says, تَكُونُوا عِبَادًا رَبَّانِيُّونَ, that you become godly human beings. To become godly is not, or being a Rabbani, is not possible without as forgiveness becoming as natural to you as the heart in your chest and the breath in your passage, I guess mistranslation. And that forgiveness does not require that you be able to do so without apology and without reparations. Interestingly, that debate often cites the legal discourse as for those who are أصحاب المنازعات والمخاصمات والأشقياء and something like that. Basically, those people who are litigious and they care about this world and they want to fight, but those of us who are beyond that, beyond courts, beyond the criminal system or the judicial system, they desire to become witnesses for God and for justice, regardless of the gains and losses within a material calculation that takes place in the world of jurisprudence. I did my best to sum up to you a very complex tradition, but a tradition that I don't know if it's been forgotten by modern Muslims, but it's definitely every bit as nuanced, and if anything, for those who claim that the idea of forgiveness was only born in a real way after sort of got out of the grasp of the divine and godly, it once again reminds us of the importance of looking at human history not just from the perspective of a single narrative of the West and its progress, but of multi-areas of the world and its intellectual progress. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to open it to some questions. So, would you like to take your own questions, or do you want me to call?
You go.
Please stand up and speak loudly.
Thank you very much for the talk. Fascinating. The distinction between the highway robbery and the robbery by stealth, the taking by stealth, was this parsed out based upon the nature of face-to-face assault and the conflict that created, perhaps the emotional conflict that the victim experienced, versus the stealth, something disappeared but someone was not, if I might use a word that's a bit pregnant right now, terrorized by the experience. And is that kind of the basis for those distinctions?
Yeah, actually, no, you're quite right. Highway robbery, the crime of Hiraba, as it was called, there were two elements always cited. The one is an adam al-ghawth, that the person is helpless or unable to defend themselves or to seek help. Second, that I forgot how it's phrased, although I wrote a book on it, but I forgot how it's phrased. But it basically something that it is a crime of in which it spreads fear, very much like piracy, that it spreads anxiety and fear and insecurity. And in Islamic law, like several other pre-modern legal systems, both piracy and highway robbery started to be seen as enemies of humankind, wherever it occurs. A hostage and menace sort of type situation. But the sariqa often, and this was an issue that we have several decisions on. If someone breaks into the house and terrorizes the occupants, are they a highway robber or a thief? And interestingly, Ibn Rushd, the grandfather of Averroes, has a very well-known fatwa in Al-Bayan wa Tahsin, Maliki book, where he says, no, if fear is terrorizing of the victim is used as an element, then it falls under the category of hiraba, highway robbery, without the highway, of course. But that the punishments are much more severe, and also the possibility of pardon or forgiveness, even with returning of property or an apology, is not possible.
Thank you.
Stunned all of you with the silence. That's power.
So, what about when it comes to family members? I've heard from a lot of Muslim sources that it's absolutely forbidden under any circumstances to abandon your parents. What happens if there was extreme abuse involved?
Oh. You said that it's absolutely forbidden what with parents?
To cut ties with them and not forgive.
Well, that idea of what you're talking about is called al-uquq, uquq al-walidain. In the modern age, a lot of it goes back to the hadith that someone who cuts their ties with their kin will not enter heaven, and so on. But like with so many issues, the classical tradition, you find a lot of, because it was a living legal system and so on, you find a lot of nuance and complexity. So for instance, there's a line of cases where a husband, and I don't know, it seems like in pre-modern times, or maybe in modern times as well, people didn't like their in-laws, and so a husband would ban his wife from seeing or visiting her parents. And the same issue, by the way, arose among Saudi jurists in the modern age, and their answer was unequivocal. Their answer was, you have to obey the husband and drop the parents. Now that's very interesting, because if you think of sexual abuse, their response in that situation is, you can't cut off the parents. But if your husband bans you from seeing your parents, then you have to cut off the parents. Now, that is usually an indicator that if you look into the classical tradition, you won't find it so simplistic and so dogmatic. And so in the classical tradition, the issue of husband banning his wife from seeing parents, there is a protracted, like a lot of pre-modern mindsets, it was seen as just unnatural for a parent to commit an offense against a child. And it was, and although you do find references here and there about a woman that mysteriously got pregnant, and who else was around this woman but her brothers and father and so on, and there's a tendency even to say, well, we should believe in the miraculous rather than a familial rape. But you find in both fatwa literature and in literature in which parents have tried to void the marriage of their kids, or on the basis that she married someone that they don't want her to marry, or in literature in which a daughter has moved away from her husband and refuses to visit, or you find a far greater willingness to accept that this is a situation that only God is powerful enough to figure out. It's so baffling for mostly these male jurists that say, oh, we are so confounded by this. We leave it up to the old divine, the all great to, may God forgive everyone and guide them to it. And it literally, a lot of these fatwa end up like this. Oh, we're confounded, may God guide everyone and forgive them. And it's left at that, which is, in contrast, Azhar, I should say, the Azhar, modern institution of Azhar, has several fatwa by Dar al-Ifta about a woman that was claimed that she was raped by her husband, and then there was a paternity test, raped by her father, and there was a paternity test, and he asked to see her, she refused. The other said he has no rights over her because he raped her. And then he was sentenced to death for the rape. And for whatever reasons, probably under family pressure, she went to the mufti and asked that her father be pardoned. And the mufti issued the fatwa saying, no, the father should not be pardoned, should be executed. And he was put to death.
Do you see opportunities for incorporating this rich tradition in the classical jurisprudence in contemporary, predominantly Muslim jurisdictions that have adopted code systems where the understanding of the system may be truncated or codified in a very simple manner compared to the richer narrative tradition?
Well, yes and no. Definitely the part about godly people, Ibad Rabbaniyun, that the nature of a godly person is, and the nature of justice requires forgiveness, is still quite strong, and you see it at many cultural levels. Especially with non-politicized movements, because politicized movements develop a very elaborate narrative of injustices that must be avenged before the world is set right. And and that's part of the demonization that goes on between political movements and Sufism, because Sufism has these elaborate narratives of forgiveness and rising above the. But the other thing I want to say is that it's quite interesting that during the Egyptian revolution, before the military coup, the tribes in Sina started with the state weakening, rekindling many of their councils of resolution of conflict. And this reminds me of in the areas that are remote in Egypt, in villages, like the village that I'm from, Miklan Anab, you can't even find on the map. I don't know till now if it has electricity or not, but 98% of all disputes were resolved through a council represented by major families. And it was considered highly insolent, arrogant, unbelievably just offensive to refuse to listen to the council or to take your case to the state. And what we notice as the cosmopolitan center gets bigger and more massive and more intrusive, and or as, for instance, in some areas in the villages in Egypt, as drug merchants came in and started challenging the authority of the councils, the culture becomes problematized in very unnatural ways, and it throws everyone into. I was just saying earlier that a lot of marital disputes were resolved in these councils. A lot of issues of honor infractions. Oh, I saw him sitting with my daughter in the fields. Whether to do how to resolve that between two families and so on. They were resolved through these informal mechanisms that had Sharia principles in them seamlessly. I mean, naturally. They didn't require a lecture. They didn't require a study. They were just embedded in people. For me, it's sad both with the introduction of the codified law and codes of law, and especially as police became more and more empowered to resolve conflicts one way or the other, it really starts tearing the fabric of society in a variety of ways.
Could you expand a little bit on how...
Could you stand up, please?
Yeah.
Speak a little loud.
Can you expand a little bit on how laws and jurists interact with the notion of forgiveness itself? Like, are the laws related to defining the boundaries and conditions for interpersonal forgiveness, or is it divine forgiveness that they're having a say on?
Well, there's a quote that I read by this Maliki jurist. I mean, jurists, you can discern two clear tendencies, two clear schools of thought, if you will, two clear trajectories. Those like Ibn Arabi, the Maliki jurist, and there are a large number of Hanafis like that, large number of Shafi'is. In other words, several schools of thought within that trajectory that tried to basically say that forgiveness by God is contingent on human forgiveness and redress of the wrong. Part of the reason for this is something I didn't talk about, there's an old distinction in all ancient legal systems between duties towards God versus duties towards human beings. In Islamic law, that discourse got flipped into rights of God versus rights of human beings. And the early on in Islam jurisprudence developed the idea that the rights of human beings will not be forgiven by God unless they are addressed first by other human beings. But with that is a later trajectory which tried to solve this dynamic by saying, in our modern terminology would say, by imposing some type of standard of reasonableness, if you will, that if a person's failure to forgive or to accept some type of making whole in some form or another is unreasonable, then it's quite possible that God would ignore the obstinance of this person. So for instance, if an attempt to return property or an attempt to make an apology or an attempt to promise not to repeat the error, I mean, this is sort of unpleasant subject, but there is a case that from a noble woman in Cairo in the Mamluki period who was slapped by her husband in front of witnesses, and he had promised that if he ever strikes her, she is automatically divorced, and he did, he apologized repeatedly and so on, and then a judge, the husband went to a judge who said her refusal to forgive him after he'd written her poetry, sent her gifts, went I don't know where and did repentance, is so unreasonable that it's inconceivable that the law would respect this level of unreasonableness. But then she went to another judge and actually got a counter judgment. And the point is that then I see that third school, which is mostly philosophical / mystical, that attempted to say, well, it's not that saying things like God's forgiveness is either contingent on human forgiveness or not is too simplistic a way of approaching it. And you really can't find just a black or white answer to that. It's a hotly debated issue because of how complex and how all the issues that it raises about God's immutability, God's power, the nature of justice, communitarian healing. A lot of jurists said, well, if God would simply forgive regardless of the harm that befell a community, wouldn't a community develop a resentment towards God? And it's, you can see it as, I would say that Islamic traditions can be seen as a bit of discursive negotiations rather than any positive commandments.
I have to ask one question of myself. Yes, Dan. What is the relationship between, you started out by talking about a number of different but related concepts, forgiveness, reconciliation, conflict resolution. We hear a lot about sulh, settlement or reconciliation, or maslahat. So what is that relationship with forgiveness in the classical tradition?
Yeah, I mean, it's there is a passage in the Quran that I didn't mention that says something to the effect that وَالصُّلْحُ خَيْرٌ وَحُضْرَةَ الْأَنفُسِ الشُّحَّ, which basically it talks about a marital dispute, and it says that sulh, reconciling, making peace is always better. And then a comment, not a conditional, but a sort of an observation that human beings are often egotistical and short-sighted. In other words, that and then various commentators said it's because God knows that when it comes to marital affairs, regardless of how much people are told that they should forgive and reconcile, they won't. That things get too heated and fights out of control and so on. And there, on the one hand, there is the whole sulh in marital affairs and in commercial affairs, especially when it's done in the context of conflict resolution, is often done without an ethic of forgiveness. And often there is an emphasis on pragmatism, sheer pragmatism. Well, if you go before a judge, it's going to cost this much, it's going to take this long, so it would just be far more practical and pragmatic decision, nearly a calculus of maslaha, a calculus of welfare, good versus harm in a practical, pragmatic sense. But at the same time, the number of in a genre of literature on how judges should conduct cases, you can't fail to notice that judges are often instructed, and this survived to the modern age, by the way, that do not decide a marital dispute, or a conflict resolution, without reminding people that if they forgive and be nice, that they will deserve God's mercy, and that as this quote, as the quote says, that فَمَنْ عَفَى اسْتَحَقَّ عَفْوَ رَبِّهِ, that whoever is able to forgive, then they truly will deserve God's forgiveness. And in more traditional settings, I mean, definitely among the shuyukh that are often involved in marital disputes in Azhar, outside of the overworked and overburdened and underpaid judges in the state system, they will often say things like, well, you know, if you forgive, then in your next marriage, God will send you a much nicer person. It basically, you know, what goes around comes around. You know, there's karma in the world, what we would say. Of course, you know, if you said karma to one of them, they'd probably call you a kafir. But anyway, but you know, and it's the same logic. You know, be nice, so you know, because otherwise God is going to make you pay for it, not just in this world, but in the hereafter. And there's where you have an intersection between the law, which tends to always look, like most legal systems, to conflict resolution, and the theological background to the law, which looks to a higher principles, I guess, metaphysical principles, transcendental principles.
One more question.
Yeah, so is Sufism the only locus where teachings on forgiveness, perhaps techniques of achieving forgiveness, exist?
No, I think that would be unfair to say. I mean, but first let me say that a lot of modern Muslims forget that there are periods in Islamic history where 70% of Muslims in any given area belong to Sufi groups. I mean, the sort of the existence of, and without Sufism, Islam would not have spread to Indonesia or Malaysia or the Philippines or China. And, I mean, there's this snobbiness that one often finds among contemporary Muslims about Sufism is historically very interesting because, and not just Sufism, but Sufism with the tradition. I mean, look at Islam in India or Pakistan. The nats and the songs, the Sufi songs and the Sufi music and so on, these were the instruments by which Islam spread, and it's remarkable. You know, you find some people who are thoroughly Wahhabi and thoroughly puritanical in their outlook, but the only music they'll make an exception for is Nusrat Ali Khan. You know, so the modern world is full of contradictions and bizarre things. But I guess the uprootedness of that we all feel in the alienation of modernity. But no, there within theological orientations, for instance, like Ash'ari texts that not Sufi Ash'ari like Ghazali, the old Ghazali, but more mainstream Ash'aris, or even within the text of many Maturidis, or there's always a discourse about the necessity of that. Basically, if you want God to be merciful towards you, you have to be merciful on this earth towards others, and that the equation is proportional. You're not merciful on this earth, God will not be merciful with you. And the level, the difference is in the level of sophistication in whether, for instance, saying, well, the whole purpose of existence is for you to bear witness for God and justice by constantly exercising mercy or forgiveness, or to say, well, if you want God to be merciful, just be merciful, you know, whenever you can, that type of thing. And level of emphasis. I mean, even among the most puritanical movements, they'll still talk about mercy, but they'll say things like, well, you know, if we are merciful when it's in situations where mercy connotes or communicates weakness, then we forego our dignity, and that is fundamentally un-Islamic and unjust. A Muslim who doesn't have dignity is not a proper Muslim. So it still goes through the track of mercy, and that's maybe what makes it makes these theological debates even tougher, because then to try to say, well, to if juxtaposed either mercy or dignity, that's two very hefty virtues going head to head in a boxing match. So you've got to have virtue and dignity and mercy. You have to make peace between them without the boxing match, and that's theologically challenging and jurisprudentially challenging.
Well, I would like to bring this evening to a close by asking you to give another round of applause.